A very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host Sumit Sarma Samir. This is Nepal-based podcast, but if you are interested to listening to the thought leaders and authors from around the world on some of the burning global issues, please subscribe to my channel. I have a very special guest in my program today. He's a globally renowned Canadian economist, Dr. Jack Mintz. Dr. Jack Mintz was a professor of economics at Queen's University from 1978 to 1989, and then at University of Toronto from 1989 to 2007. After leaving the University of Toronto, he founded the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary in 2008 and served as its director until 2015. During that period, the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary became a leading voice in Canadian public policy. Today, the School of Public Policy is the most cited and most visible policy school in Canada. Dr. Mintz has also served in the boards of several large private institutions, has served in many public commissions, and has provided his consulting expertise worldwide for institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and the OECD. Dr. Mintz has a regular column in the Financial Post newspaper in Canada, writing on a variety of economic and public policy related issues of national and international importance. In 2012, Dr. Mintz received the Queen's Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contribution to Canadian tax policy. Then in 2015, he received the Order of Canada, the second highest civilian honor in Canada for his overall contribution to Canada. It's my immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Mintz in my program. Jack, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let me begin by asking about the economic health of Canada itself. You're one of the Canada's leading economists, and as a Canadian economist, how would you say Canada's economy is doing right now? Are there any dangers, any pitfalls on how the economy is being handled?
Well, I think if you look at Canada's growth rate right now, it's not too bad. It's around 1%, which isn't very good, but certainly it's certainly been we'll say adequate. But I think the biggest issue right now is that almost all that growth now has been coming from immigration. More people coming into the country, which is a good thing. There's Canadians by and large like that. There are some issues that we could talk about later, but by and large, Canadians welcome immigrants, and in fact, Canada has been always built by immigrants going back to its beginning. However, I think the bigger issue right now is the fact that we are doing very poorly in terms of per capita growth in either GDP or in gross national income. It really doesn't matter. In fact, it's been stagnant over the past 6 years, and in fact, the last 2 years we've actually had negative GDP growth, per capita GDP growth. In other words, any growth that we're getting, it's all from immigration. In fact, there's more population growth than there is growth in actual output per person, and that is a very serious concern because, as every economist will say, going back to the start of time, I think when economics has always been written, that it's very important to have some growth in the economy in terms of per capita growth, productivity. Otherwise, you're not doing very well, and I think that is a huge issue for Canada, as we are really slipping behind, particularly the United States, which has huge economic influence over us.
Right. And what do you believe are some of the critical changes that are needed today in Canada's economics policy?
Well, I think we have to, when it comes to productivity, let's put it this way: there's lots of ideas that are always expressed. There's lots of studies have been stating where some of the shortages are and things like that. And of course, in my view, there's no silver bullet that will help, I think, generate more growth for the economy, particularly more productivity. However, there are a number of things that are particularly concerning. Growth comes from, as we know, when it comes to how much output you get per working hour. It comes from capital deepening, in other words, investment. It comes from human capital, growth in human capital, and it also comes from the way that we allocate resources in the economy, whether we're putting it to their best use. And I think right now, I think the two major issues are with respect to, particularly with respect to investment, which has been very poor over the past almost decade now, which is a real concern, I think, in terms of our ability to grow the economy when our investment rate is so low. In fact, it's now below the OECD on average, and it's well below United States. And it's reflecting both a lack of investment in tangible capital, like machines and buildings, but it's also reflecting not a sufficient investment in what you might call intangible investment, which is the basically research and development and exploration development in the mining and oil and gas sector, as well as other types of resources, which has always been important to Canada. So I think I think the investment issue is particularly concerning. We have less investment per worker per working hour compared to other countries, and we certainly have weak innovation rates, whether it's research and development or other factors that might reflect innovation as well. So these things are problematical, particularly for Canada. On the human capital side, we've always had a good education system. I think that's been a very positive thing. If anything, there's been a mismatch of skills demanded by firms and skills that are available that are provided by individuals. And of course, we've had an immigration policy that has tried to bring in skilled workers, but I think it's it's an issue that a number of businesses are facing, especially since the pandemic, and getting enough skilled labor for what they need.
Right. I think there's been, difficulty for even the international students and people who have been migrating from different parts of the country to get a job. I think there's been cut down in the job as well if you compare that with, a couple of years back in Canada. But let's keep that aside for a moment, Jack. I want to really get some insights on the global economy as a whole. Please tell us, what do you believe are the most pressing economic challenges right now facing the global economy, the global economy today?
Well, I think we have to go back to I think to maybe 20 years ago and kind of look at what global economy was like then, and we really actually had a pretty good time in the sense that China was coming on stream. It was bringing its huge labor supply to the world. We also had Russia that actually was working with the West and not opposing the West. We also had a Washington consensus that sort of argued, let's try to deregulate, undertake tax reforms, try to do a number of things that basically try to generate more investment and more growth in the world market. A lot of that changed since 2003. Part of it was the financial crisis in 2008, the concerns over inequality. In fact, the concerns over maybe the rich were doing too well. But then there was a growth of also nationalism. So now today, when you look at 2024, we're seeing much more conflict, geopolitical conflict going on, East and West blocks. We're seeing also tightening of trade amongst countries, even amongst allies to some extent. I mean, the United States, with its Inflation Reduction Act, brought in all sorts of rules that basically favored production in the United States. It did provide some exemption for Mexico and Canada that it has done before. But the main point is that it has tightened up even trade with Europe in these kinds of actions. And so we're getting tougher borders. We're getting a reduction in trade. Actually, it does show in the data. And of course, we know this can have a negative impact on economic growth. In the meantime, we are seeing on the positive side new technologies that are coming in that could have quite huge impacts on productivity, particularly with respect to artificial intelligence. And so we'll have to, see how that impacts across the world, because it may be that some parts of the world are going to be left badly behind, while others do very well. And I think the U.S. itself, I think, is still a very dynamic economy when it comes to technology.
So, in that context, in your opinion, what role does government intervention play in shaping economy outcomes, particularly in times of crisis like this? I mean, I say crisis because somehow we have been failed to making the sense of the kind of society and the state that is evolving right now. So, what kind of role can state play?
Well, I think what worries me is the state is maybe playing too much of a role, in the sense that now we're seeing this growth of nationalism. And that's what happens when governments start getting more power. They start to want to favor, I think, their particular constituents. And this growth of nationalism, I think, is a concern, because this is the sort of thing that we saw years ago, when it led to some very unhappy results in terms of geopolitical conflict and other things. And a good example of this is the energy transition, which I didn't mention yet. But that is where you have heavy government intervention, because we are trying to deal with global warming and essentially what economists will call an externality, where people's actions in terms of consuming fossil fuels is releasing more carbon into the air, and that is a real concern over the consequences of that over the coming century. It's a very tough problem because it requires international cooperation, and if you don't get international cooperation, it's not going to be easily solved. And at the same time, you have governments that are intervening very heavily in the economy. And it's not entirely clear they really know what they're doing. In fact, one of the biggest risks, and this I know in the Canadian data itself, is that the most output per working hour that's generated in Canada is actually in oil and gas extraction. And if you shift labor out of that sector and put it into other sectors, you're obviously in the short run going to have a decline in GDP. That's not necessarily a negative thing, to the extent that we're trying to deal with the problem over the coming century, but it is a consequence that we have to remind ourselves that whatever policies we bring in, we have to be very conscious of their economic costs. And I think this is a big problem, that especially with our government in Canada, we're picking targets that are totally unrealistic, have a heavy cost associated with them. And that's what often comes along with government intervention, because governments themselves are not necessarily fully aware of what they're doing, and tend to be very pushed by the politics, as opposed to thinking about the economic and consequences of their actions. And I think this is a very big concern I have, not just in Canada but in other parts of the world, where we're not approaching the issue in a way to make sure that we actually minimize the costs of getting through the energy transition, where right now I think we're carrying out all sorts of policies pancaked on each other that have significant distortions, administrative and compliance costs that I think can be quite negative in terms of economic growth in the long run, making it even harder, I think, for eventual political support for these kinds of policies when people start seeing how much energy prices go up and the costs that are being imposed in terms of their daily life.
Right. Jack, I remember, 20 years back when we used to talk about globalization and neoliberal policies and all. It was a pretty euphoric time to talk about all these things. Now it's a bit difficult to make sense of what's unfolding. Could you share your thoughts on the current state of globalization and its impact on economies around the world?
Well, it's interesting. People sometimes talk about the end of globalization. I think that we're taking some step backwards, but I don't think we're ending globalization. I think there's huge benefits associated with trade, and that should never be forgotten. In fact, while we do worry about making sure that people have incomes and a country does relatively well from trade, but we often discount the tremendous benefits that consumers get from lower prices, and this can be just like giving them a huge transfer when you reduce consumer prices in the economy, and we shouldn't forget that that's a significant benefit associated with trade. But But I think the difficulty now with globalization is all the geopolitics that are now operating. The conflicts between the East and the West, and the formation really of an East bloc that could be a counterbalance to the Western alliance. The West makes up about 50% of the world GDP, and the balance is other parts of the world, not necessarily part of the East bloc. A country like India is very sharp in trying to play a neutral role between, amongst everyone, and having good relations amongst everyone. But still, there's different interests that each of the parts of the world have. And when you actually look at growth rates around the world, it's still the highest growth rates are still in what you would call the non-Western alliance. And that's something that's important to remember. I was just looking at numbers the other day, and the world, the world, when you look at what's happening outside of North America, Europe, Japan, that when you look at the rest of the world, it's growing at a rate at least twice more than North America and Europe.
Yeah, Jack. On that note, sorry to interrupt. What will that imply? What does it mean?
Well, what it means is that you're going to see continuing growth, I think, in other parts of the world, and that means that that part of the world is going to grow faster and get bigger, and in fact, they'll be able to offer a standard of living to their people that, in fact, might even attract them to stay at home rather than to immigrate to other parts of the world. And so, I've been arguing that globalization over the years is. And the shift in terms of the demographics, which I think is another very important issue. High-income countries are all aging quite rapidly right now, and they are looking for workers, and that, of course, is important to keep in mind as part of the whole equation. So that's making actually international labor markets more competitive as a result. But if the middle countries and continue to keep growing at a rate faster than the high income countries, I think, and I mean that in terms of per capita incomes, not in terms of total growth. I think that's going to have an impact on imbalances. It's going to make it tougher for high income countries to bring in the kind of skilled workers they want if the other parts of the world can offer good jobs to their own people, because most people want to stay with their families and stay with the country they've lived in. And so I think this is going to be an interesting thing to watch in terms of globalization. And then certainly we're having much different capital markets today. We're getting huge demands, especially with the energy transition, for investment, and potentially with some new technologies that are coming along the way, other technologies. And at the same time, as you have this aging population, which is happening worldwide, by the way, except for the lowest income countries, that you're going to be seeing a fall in savings, and so real interest rates are going to be, as we see now, are higher than they were 5-6 years ago. And it also means that deficits are going to be more of a problem for governments, and so there's going to be a lot of issues that are going to have to be dealt with in the coming years. As a result of this major shift that's happening, both demographic and technological shifts that are happening in the world.
Right. And how long do you see that this process would continue? I ask this in reference to the growth of middle income countries.
Oh, I see that as a process really much of the century, and what it means exactly, I don't know. I always argue that it's not that easy to predict what the world is going to be like in 30 years, or 70 years. So if you look at a good example that I used to always talk about this in various speeches, is that if you go back to 1913, for example, there was a book written called 1913, which was kind of a survey of different parts of the world, different cities, and what life was like at that time. And it was very interesting when you read the book. None of them anyone would have predicted that in the next 30 years, you would end up having two major world wars, and a depression happening, all within 30 years from 1913.
Oh, that was not predicted at that point of time.
Absolutely not. And of course, we're sitting now at 2024, and we're talking about 2050. That we're going to get to net zero and all that sort of stuff. But we know that there's going to be all sorts of things that are going to happen over the next 20, 30 years. And that's going to take us in different courses. And we saw a bit of that in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that had a huge impact, of course, on energy markets. And it has had a very important impact also on trade flows now that are occurring around the world.
What are some of the common misconceptions that people have about economic policy and its implementation, Jack?
Well, I think people are not humble enough about what works and doesn't work. And I think people forget history. I think that's the worst part of it. We've had lots of examples of different types of policies that people tried in the past that didn't work, and there's good reasons they don't work. My favorite example used to be an incentive in Quebec that they gave to three towers. It was a tax holiday in the middle of Montreal for high-tech firms. And who had benefited was not the high-tech firms. It was the landlords of the three buildings that were able to charge higher rents. And so you don't really encourage more high-tech if you're going to end up just making their inputs more expensive doing something like that. There's lots of examples of that various policies that are being carried on. And some of them get pushed, by politics, and some of the things that governments do, of course, end up undermining really the policy that's being done. For example, I worked on tax holidays with the World Bank and IMF for years, going to various countries, basically trying to get them out of their tax holidays because it's such a high revenue cost associated with very little bang to it. And one of the reasons they didn't have as much bang to it is that, first of all, governments put on all sorts of conditions to get the tax holiday. So you might be giving a benefit, but then you take away a significant part of the benefit with all sorts of rules associated with the tax holiday. But then the other thing is that people forget that when it comes to long life capital, tax holidays aren't all that great. I mean, if you're investing in, let's say, a major manufacturing plant that's going to live for 30, 40, 50 years, and you give a 10-year tax holiday, you're busy writing off all sorts of costs during the holiday that aren't going to be available, or you're diminishing their availability, like depreciation costs and things like that, that are after the holiday. And in fact, you don't really give that much of a bang to long-term investments when you have tax holidays. Plus, it's the short-term aspect of it all that I think has some negative impacts. It's well known that you'd have a textile firm in one, operating in one part of the street. Their tax holiday was over, and then they moved to the other side of the street and call themselves a new firm, and they get another tax holiday. So these are all kind of examples of policies that, after many years of studying, they don't work, but yet politicians cling to them, and it's because they're trying to make their public happy. But of course, as we know, not everything works very well. And that's what worries me, particularly right now, about the significant change that's occurring, both in terms of the energy transition, as well as the adoption of new technologies that are going to be quite disruptive, I think, to economies. And of course, as soon as governments start getting into it, if they're not careful in terms of how they develop their policies, they can end up making things a lot worse rather than better as a result of the changes that are going to be coming ahead in the coming.
Right. So, Jack, I always get fascinated with the history as well as, the kind of time we are living in. The disruption word is often used. My question on putting both of these things together would be, what lesson can we learn from historical economic crisis? I mean, the kind of world we are living in right now, does those economic crises and lessons from history would serve anything for the time of this disruption that we are living in?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I would have a very good answer for that one, because I think it's as we look back, when you get governments that become very nationalistic and protectionist, that and conflict arises, that we end up with some very negative results. But then we get over them, and then we move ahead afterwards. But it's with a lot of harm that's created in the meantime. So I really that's what worries me today most about what's happening. I sort of look at it as a very significant change that's occurring within 20, 25 years since, let's say, 2000. That has been a shift almost from something like the Enlightenment age that we had back in the 1700s to the Romantic age, and then leading to some very ugly periods in our history, particularly at the start of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century. So those trends. That's what's worrying me the most today. Are those trends that are occurring at a very rapid pace, and I think it's. I think the big question is going to be leadership, world leadership, and I think the United States has been absolutely critical for leadership. It was the biggest superpower for the past number of years. It's been like the Roman Empire, having huge influence across the world. But today, when you look at the kind of leadership in the United States, the increased polarization that's occurring there, plus in other parts of the world, like in Europe, between different right and left, et cetera, whatever right and left means these days, their issue. But certainly between, as one person calls it, parties have become clubs. It's not left and right anymore. In fact, their positions shift around all the time, but people adhere to a certain club in a political sense. But I think the main point is that we are seeing, I think, a less tolerant society in accepting what other points of view are and things like that, and not willing to talk to each other. And I think all these things, I think, are very concerning, that go beyond the economics. And in fact, if anything, economics helps pull people together rather than pulling them apart. But I think this is the biggest concern I have today, is really over politics in the world as opposed to the economics of the world.
Right. So in this context, in this kind of given context, how should a country like Nepal, which is kind of least developing country, prepare to tap into the economic trends that's evolving? Well,
I think I'm not an expert in Nepal. In fact, I'm not as conversant with that part of the world. Even though over the years I've worked, with Latin American countries. In fact, right now I'm working on some projects related to Latin America and the Caribbean countries, and I've worked in the East Asia part of the world and Europe and things like that. But I haven't been as conversant when it comes to the subcontinent in Asia. But I was looking at Nepal's growth. Actually, even though Nepal, certainly per capita incomes are on the low side, it's about $1,400, I think, around US per capita for gross national income. But it has grown 6 times in the past 20 years. And that is pretty impressive. So I think, Nepal's relationships, I think, with China, India, and potentially maybe with the Middle East part, its trading relationships, I think, could be very important for the country to maintain, maintain its growth. And I think obviously something has been good happening in the past 20 years. And I guess the question, can there be more that can be done? But I would have to really study Nepal much more than what I know right now to understand what the policies that were working very well the past 20 years and which ones can be adopted that do very well. I do look at some countries like Estonia and Ireland, which are relatively small countries, and they have done phenomenally well. In fact, Ireland has grown. It's been one of the fastest growing countries in the world for some time now. But even in the past six, 8, 9 years, 8 years, they've actually, have their GDP per capita has grown, almost, or GNP, actually, gross national income per capita has actually grown by 55%, which is actually pretty good, higher than most countries, I can tell you. Estonia has been the second highest fast growing country. And I know in both cases it was a matter of very smart economic reforms that were undertaken, a combination of education, infrastructure, technology, but also corporate tax reform has had a huge impact on these countries in allowing them to attract immense amount of multinational capital coming to their countries. And so I think these are the kinds of things that one has to look at what can actually work and what can't work.
Right, right. So, Jack, before we really wrap up, I want to have a last question for you. Looking at the developments, looking ahead, and what developments or trends do you believe will have the most significant impact in the field of economics in the next decade? Perhaps let me rephrase this question. What are the most important issues that economics might be grappling in the next decade?
Well, that's actually a really tough question to answer. I'm trying to predict, what's going to be relevant over the next 30 years, because we have seen some tremendous advancements in economics, both in terms of empirical methodology as well as in theoretical methodology. Just the growth of analysis, looking at decision making and behavioral economics, for example, has been pretty astounding. I think that we're probably going to see a revamp in macroeconomics. I think that's going to be one of the areas that I think might need to have significant change. I think the pandemic explained, I think, to us our lack of understanding of the supply side of economies, which played a very big role in terms of how. What happened during the pandemic and the response afterwards with the pandemic. And even today we're seeing that, that the decline in inflation, after this huge increase in monetary expansion in 2020, that did lead to, I think, much higher inflation than we've seen. But then it's been coming down partly because monetary policies reacted in a way of tightening up the market. But also, I don't think we fully understood how the supply side of the economy really plays a role. Because even monetary policy itself, when you look at the basic monetary model, it's a demand related model. It's not. There's the concept of supply isn't there, neither in a lot of macro models. And there are macro models that do try to model the supply side, but they get more into microeconomics to do that. But I think we need to rethink how expectations, how supply plays a role in our macro models, and how government policies can impact on things like interest rates and prices and et cetera. And I think those are going to be one of the areas which I think we'll probably see a lot of new development that might be partly related to these new micro innovations and looking at the way people form their decisions, and so the standard rationality models, I think, are going to be more and more challenged, which is good, and I think it will be shown it'll show up also, I think, in the way that we think of the world and the way it operates.
Right. Jack, on that note, I really like to thank you for your time. I'm extremely honored for your presence in my show. Thank you so much.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.